So this is just a quick recording in response to some of the discussions that we've been having lately and wanting a little bit more concrete information about how to apply intersectionality to public health practice. And just to make sure we're all working with a shared definition of what we mean when we say intersectionality, I'm talking about the different parts of our identities that may intersect, that may have different varying levels of situation within systems of oppression and power, and that shape the ways in which we navigate through the world. And then just a quick reminder of how intersectionality relates to fundamental causes of health. Fundamental causes are ones that influence multiple health outcomes, affect outcomes via multiple risk factors, involve access to resources. So again, going back to that notion of power, and are causes of health outcomes that are reproduced over time. Systems of repression are ones that are mutually constituted and work together to produce inequality, which means that you often have issues of intersectionality really happening at the nexus of different systems of oppression. And one of the things to think about as we're moving through this is some examples of how intersectionality may or may not fit the criteria for what it means to be linked to fundamental causes of health. The citation for if you want to find out a little bit more information about fundamental cause theory is in the bottom of the slide. I'll make the slide sets available as well if you are interested in finding out a little bit more about that. And then something else to consider just as a point of clarification, because this is terminology that can sometimes get misused when we're talking about fundamental causes. It's not just the fact that we're looking at things through an intersectionality lens, but rather the oppression and the systems of repression that we're thinking about when we're talking about intersectionality that we're referring to when we're talking about fundamental causes. In the same way that race isn't a fundamental cause, but racism is, that's the exact same thing that we're talking about here. So in terms of intersectionality and data collection, we can really think about data collection in sort of these two different ways. An additive approach, which looks at social inequality, sort of layering on top of one another, different marginalized identities. So you're looking at your race and then you add on a potential sexual orientation or a gender identity and then anything else first. So that mentality of someone being Black first, a lesbian second, and a woman third, to use the terminology of Dr. Broleg that we're referencing here today. Whereas an intersectional approach isn't really looking to disentangle, so there isn't a first, second, third order to the system of oppression that we're looking at, but recognizing once again that those are mutually constituted. So what someone faces in day-to-day challenges in terms of their race can be influenced and often is by their gender and their sexual orientation or gender expression simultaneously. Another really useful example about intersectionality in terms of data analysis is this one presented by Dr. Nancy Lopez. And here she's looking at the probability of sixth-year graduation rates by race, ethnicity, gender, and class over an extended period of time. And so what you'll look at here is if, for example, we're taking a look at American Indians, you see a marginal effect that's trending toward the negative direction, right? And then if we combine simultaneously American Indians and being of low income, you see even further the negative marginal effect. If, however, we were to combine being an American Indian, low income, and male, what you see is actually a reversal of this. This is far deeper into the positive marginal effect than you would see in either of those two things. So you start to take a look at how looking at things simultaneously rather than in this hierarchical approach that tends to be favored or has been favored historically in these statistical analyses and the quantitative analyses that we've employed in public health, it becomes a very different story. So it's, again, not a question of necessarily disentangling these different identities and the systems of repression, those members of those, populations may be subjected to, but really looking at how all of them simultaneously are functioning to affect the lived experiences and health outcomes of individuals and populations. And what that really starts to talk about is the compounding effects of intersecting identities. And for this, syndemics is really helpful. Syndemics being that biosocial interaction of health and disease, where you see this sort of clustering of illnesses or health disparities or health inequities in certain populations of people that have similar intersectional identities. And as an example, I'll use this indigenous red ribbon storytelling study, which was looking at how indigenous people living with HIV construct and understand their experiences of getting on antiretroviral therapy. And this took place in Canada, just as a point of reference. When we're talking about the majority of participants and their intersectional dimensions, we're looking at substance users, as well as those living with HIV, as well as those who are indigenous to a country that doesn't necessarily value indigenous populations. And so pulling from that, what we see is this really complex way of understanding factors that affect antiretroviral therapy use among urban indigenous people living with HIV in Saskatchewan. And so this can really feel like it's a bear to really manage, but let's break it down a little bit more. If we're looking at access to therapy, which includes acceptance of antiretroviral therapy and adherence to therapy as sort of our central points of interest in terms of public health. These red spots that you'll see are the ones where we're talking about how active drug use affects them. So physicians refusing antiretroviral therapy to those that are actively using drugs, the congregation socially and geographically of people living with active substance use disorders that are all in the same area, selling, buying, and using drugs, the restrictive health policies that guide treatment for drug use disorders, that cycle of relapse into drug use, recovery from, and then that sort of cycle, which you'll see as the nexus point right here, and then how methadone maintenance therapy can affect antiretroviral therapy. And then we layer on top of that to help us clarify our understandings the factors that impact living with HIV. So the long wait times for HIV biomarker testing, the individual knowledge of what viral load and CD4 counts mean, the individuals who are living with HIV and their ability to co-plan with a healthcare provider, the feelings of embarrassment around directly observed antiretroviral therapy. So you're seeing that in this schematic, we're not really placing one as being more important than the other, but starting to layer together the different ways of understanding things in order to see how different factors of this intersectional approach really affect the outcomes of interest. And then as a fourth point, all of the different factors that affect indigenous people living with HIV. So the historical relationships, the racial discrimination that they continue to experience, the residential school segregation legacies, the mistrust of institutions with authoritative power that include healthcare establishments, the valuing or devaluing of different health systems, of traditional healing strategies are things that are important to individuals. And you really start to see what that looks like in terms of these black boxes that I introduced being points that we can then use in terms of public health efforts. So really, for example, the location of a healthcare agency, given all of the different colored components that we've layered together, how that can directly affect the ability to access ARV therapy, the negative outcome expectations that we can target when we're talking about either health counseling or intervening on health behaviors, and how that can influence acceptance of ARV therapy. Again, not necessarily placing more importance on whether you're an Indigenous person or you're a person who has an active or relapsing substance disorder, or you're a person who has HIV, like understanding that all of those sort of live together in the person or in those communities that we're talking about, and then leveraging the assets that are present in these communities, that social routine, that social connectedness, those ability to have a positive outlook and to set goals and have management of an illness that's centering the person and their lived experiences and what they hold valuable in a way that helps with adherence to ARV therapy and helps with any potential education that includes acceptance of that ARV therapy. And so again, intersectional approaches aren't necessarily meant to make it easier to do these kinds of analysis because we're not really disentangling one from the other, but they're intended to help make it more possible to disentangle all of the complexities that come with the human experience. Now, shifting a little bit away from data analysis and talking a little bit more broadly about intersectionality and policy, this is one where intersectionality, again, emphasizes the importance of context. Just like the quantitative analysis example that I provided a second ago, this is one where experiencing the exact same sort of outcome in a very different way means that you have to tailor your policies. And an example that I wanted to give here is we're talking about Spanish speakers and members of indigenous groups for whom Spanish isn't that first language in Bolivia and Peru, where ethnicity is a really important part of how women's educational outcomes play out. Whereas in a different global context like the Philippines, where ethnicity appears to have a lot less big of an impact on educational outcomes, you can't apply those same policies to those multiple contexts because the outcomes are different based on ethnicity. So you can't really just look at it, ethnicity and gender as the things that you want to look that are important for determining this health policy. Intersectionality helps us really get away from that generalizing that is going to keep us from like really having the public health impacts that are helpful, because it keeps us centered on the context and the different ways in which the exact same outcomes can be experienced and achieved differently based on the other identities that are at play when you're looking at something. So given what an intersectional perspective looks like in public health, I think it's important to also name what a non-intersectional perspective looks like in public health. So if intersectionality is really looking at the context and multiple forms of living and understanding and being, a non-intersectional perspective is really looking at someone is Black or white, someone is male or female, really looking at dichotomous outcomes. It's not taking into account the resources that different populations have, even if you're targeting that population to really approaching health from more of a deficit perspective than the assets that are present. It doesn't take into account necessarily the social experiences or the social systems that are at play. It looks typically more at outcomes as either the person has the disease or doesn't have the disease. The person gets infected with HIV or doesn't get infected with HIV. The person is virally suppressed or is not virally suppressed. The person completes their degree in X number of time or they don't. It doesn't take into consideration historical experiences or generational trauma typically, because that's just more complicated and requires some different techniques. And it typically ignores the relationship between privilege and oppression and how those systems continue to be created on a regular basis and affect the health outcomes of the individuals that we're looking to help. And probably above all, a non-intersectional approach is attempting to create those one-size-fits-all solutions to some of our persistent public health problems. So what does it mean to design solutions from an intersectional perspective? Really, it starts at the very beginning when you're asking yourself, what kind of project your team wants to take on, and really taking the time to think about how your own or the members of your project teams, social positions may play a role at each stage of the process in development. Why are you even interested in this hot topic? Why are you interested in this population? And how does that impact the ways in which you engage with or don't these individuals and these issues and these contexts? So regularly asking how social identities are relevant to the project, not just the people that are engaging in the project, the people that the project is engaging with, but also the voices that are most dominant or centered in this context. It applies in your design as well. What data needs to be collected? What data needs to be disaggregated in order to enable an intersectional analysis? How are the questions being formulated themselves? What are they saying about the intersecting identities that we're holding as valuable? What does that mean for the potential proposed solutions that we want to come up with? How are we interpreting things within the wider context? Are there any unexpected findings or identities that only emerge as important during the data? And how will you know that? What analyses do you have planned to find that out? Finding, what do you do when it comes to policy and practice where you're looking at things at a population level? So there's a certain level at which you have to stop intersecting those identities. And how do you balance that individualization with trying to provide benefits to as many people as you can to address inequities, inequalities, systemic vulnerabilities, gaps in our ability to provide equitable services within public health. And then one of the final things that I want to make sure to touch on is intersectional activism. I won't do it here for the purposes of brevity, but I strongly recommend this Kimberly Crenshaw video that I will make sure to link, about the urgency of intersectionality and how intersectionality matters for activism. I alluded to this just briefly, but when we're talking about balancing between other folks' identities and trying to develop solutions within public health, you're not just thinking about your own intersections, but you're also thinking about the intersections mixed with others. So in more traditional approaches to public health efforts, we tend to take this really linear approach that is on one end of the spectrum looking at social identity or categorization. And on the other end of the spectrum, it's looking at particularization or your personal identity. How individual are you? And any person's given identity is attributed to where on this one axis they are at any given moment between identifying with the social group and individuating. What we learn from intersectionality is that it's really more three-dimensional than that. It's a personal identity layered with social identities and the clusters of similar social identities and the extent to which the people around you share those intersectional identities. So as a quick takeaway slide, intersectionality is multiplicative and not additive. That's both conceptually and analytically. Identities can't be separated, and when we try and do so, we've lost our ability to really fully understand the project, or the question at hand rather. Having membership in some oppressed identities doesn't necessarily negate the ways an individual can be privileged through other identities. Using intersectionality, as I mentioned before, doesn't make things easier, but not having it means that there are things that you simply cannot measure. It's a lens that you carry through, not all the way from conceptualization to dissemination, and then loops back around. So again, that notion of praxis, action and reflection, and thinking about it all the way through so that you're constantly iterating in response to what it is that you're learning along the way. And then always keeping in mind that there are going to be identities that you can't assume because you can't see them. And don't be afraid to ask questions of yourselves, of each other, of stakeholders, of the recipients of those services that we're trying to provide, get the feedback, and then loop it back to integrate for that continual improvement. And then some additional slides for those that may want a little bit of additional information or resources. And if there's further discussion that any of you all would like to have, then I'm happy to have that with you. and we'll set up a time to just sort of chat so it's not just a recorded lecture. But aside from that, I thank you and look forward to hearing feedback.